What we're actually trying to do is to interfere with the pain signaling coming from the periphery, from the vulva, all the way through to the brain. And this drug will be interfering with that. But more importantly, as people develop a chronic state and reinforcement of the pain, it will also break that reinforcement as well. And therefore, it could actually be a game changer really in this field.
Welcome to Baubo. Millions of women are living with vaginismus and vulvodynia, and they think they're alone. I'm Mathilde, and I spent years struggling alone until I finally got the help I needed. In this podcast, I'm bringing you the very best experts to answer every question you have. Let's get into it. Today, I'm speaking with John Connell, the Chief Scientific Officer at MAC Clinical Research in the UK. There is no medication approved specifically for vulvodynia, not a single one. John and his team are trying to change that fact and currently running a clinical trial on a drug called Pudafensine for vulvodynia. Pudafensine works by increasing dopamine in the brain, which most people associate with pleasure and reward, but actually also plays a key role in modulating pain. And in preclinical trials, the results have been really promising. They're actively recruiting people to participate in this trial right now, and in this episode, we get into the science of how it works, what the early data is showing, and what it actually looks like to take part. I really hope you enjoy the episode, and if you're in a position to, please consider reaching out to MAC Clinical Research to see whether you can participate, because research like this is really crucial for bringing this field forward and getting better treatment options to people who need them. Welcome, John. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about this clinical trial that you're currently recruiting for.
Thank you very much.
So can you start by just telling us a bit about yourself, your background, and also what your company, MAC Clinical Research, does?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, from my own perspective, I've been in clinical research now for over 35 years. I've mainly worked with the pharmaceutical industry in taking drugs into man for the first time. And my area of interest has always been to try to find ways to accelerate the development of really good products, very new and novel treatments, and also to, if you like, get rid of the products that don't work too well, to get answers more quickly, to move products to the market faster. I joined MAC Clinical Research about 11 years ago, but MAC is much older than that. It's one of the oldest independent CROs, contract research organizations in the UK. We operate from 10 clinical sites across the north of England. And our focus really is working in partnership with pharmaceutical companies to find ways to develop their product quickly, more rapidly, to show that drugs are safe, and then to take them into patients and see, do these potential compounds actually have legs, and are they going to be developable as active treatments? And that's really where we've come to with this Vulvodynia program that we're working on at the moment.
Yes, very exciting. So let's get into talking about this drug, this novel drug that you're testing. What is Pudafensine and what is it being developed to do?
Pudafensine is a very interesting compound. It works on certain chemicals in the brain, neurotransmitters that are monoamines. But in particular, they have mild effects on serotonin, but the main effect is on the dopamine system. And that is a system in the brain which is very much involved in a lot of CNS disease, anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, but all sorts of areas. But most importantly, it's also involved in pain as well. Now, unlike other treatments that have been developed that work on the dopamine system, I think Pudafensine is very specific in the way that it works. Our partnership with Initiator Pharma, who are developing this, they're a Danish biotech company. It goes back now for about 6 or 7 years. So when they were initially looking to develop the drug, we did their early safety studies. And our interest at that time was piqued because we were looking at a drug which would affect monoamine by blocking reuptake, in particular in certain areas like the mesolimbic system and also in the brainstem itself. And these are areas which are very much associated with emotion and with pain control. Unlike some other drugs which are really wide and target many, many different areas, we felt this is a very specific drug. So initially, this must be, about 7 years ago now, we did initial studies looking at whether the drug was safe or not. So the compound has to be given to healthy people. You start at a very low dose, you build up, and you build a safety profile so that you understand whether the drug is causing any side effects. And then you take that into patients and start looking at whether it's going to have an effect in modulating pain, etc.
I'd love to start unpacking some of the things that you mentioned already, and bear with me now because I don't have a science background, but I was wondering if we can go a bit deeper into understanding the mechanisms behind this, and maybe starting with just understanding a bit more the role of neurotransmitters and also maybe which neurotransmitters are most relevant to understanding pain. You've alluded to a bit already, but I just, could we start there?
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems when something goes wrong, when people suffer chronic pain conditions, whether it's with vulvodynia or other pain conditions, it's a breakdown in pain control mechanisms. So if you're looking at the body where we have nerves talking to nerves all the way through from the periphery right through the spinal cord and into the brain, a lot of that is mediated by these things called neurotransmitters, where they leave one nerve and they go into the synaptic cleft and they move forward onto the next nerve, causing that to fire. Often a lot of the conditions where we have pain, and particularly chronic pain states, are caused by a lack of certain neurotransmitters, particularly dopamine, in various centers of the brain. And what this drug will be doing is normally when a monoamine like dopamine is produced and released, a lot of it then gets absorbed back into the neuron that it came from and is gone from the synapse. What this compound will be doing is preventing that happening. So it will artificially, if you like, increase the levels of monoamine in that area, and therefore will really help to increase the reactivity of later neurons. And we know that in particular, there are certain areas of the brain which are involved in pain modulation, that are involved in how we perceive ongoing pain. And that's where we think this drug will be particularly targeted.
Okay, so if I understand it correctly, we have nerve cells which are constantly sending signals to each other about everything, right? From pain and sensation and movement and so forth. But as you mentioned, they don't actually touch each other and they have these synapses, the like gap between them where the neurotransmitter is sent from one cell to another or a nerve cell to another. And you mentioned this concept of reuptake, and it's also something that we hear in other medications like SSRIs, right? Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Can you explain a bit more about that mechanism of reuptake in terms of what's actually happening at that gap between nerve cells after the message is sent? Like, what does it have to be retrieved again, if that makes sense?
Yeah, the body is constantly producing these neurotransmitters. And what happens in a normal case of events is that effectively too much is produced and a certain amount gets reabsorbed and doesn't interact with later receptors. So what we're having here is, now you mentioned the SSRIs, which do, of course, really affect systems really across the whole brain and are associated with some side effects that we would not be looking for with many drugs that you're trying to develop today. We think that this drug in particular, Pudafensine, will have a positive effect because it is much more specific in the areas that it's working on. It's not going to be affecting every area, but specifically we know from preclinical, from animal trials, that it's working in those areas of the brain which are involved in sexual conduct, are involved in pain, really areas that are very relevant to what we're looking for when we try to target what is an area of very much unmet need.
Okay, interesting. And can we then, again, understanding a bit more the mechanism behind this. So in the case of vulvodynia, where you have certain, maybe a touch happening in the vulvar tissues, in the periphery, as you mentioned, that then sends a signal up via the spinal cord up to the brain. And then this drug is somehow increasing the amount of dopamine, which then counteracts that pain signal. Is that how we should understand it?
Yeah, what we're actually trying to do is to interfere with the pain signaling coming from the periphery, in this case, from the vulva, all the way through to the brain. And this drug will be interfering with that. But more importantly, as people develop a chronic state and you then suffer reinforcement of the pain, it will also break that reinforcement as well. And therefore, if it does work, which of course, what we're doing is an experiment, we have to test whether it's going to work. But if it does work, it will make a significant reduction in pain and could actually be a game changer really in this field.
I wanted to talk about cover how this is different from what patients may already be on, because many of our listeners will already be taking maybe a low dose tricyclic antidepressant like amitriptyline or an SNRI. So can you talk a bit about how Pudafensine's mechanism then meaningfully differs from what they're already taking?
I think, it's a really good question, actually. I think to answer that, we need to go perhaps a step back from that and think about how we actually diagnose the condition in the first place. Very widespread condition. In fact, 18 million people across Europe, about 8% of females over 18 will suffer from this condition at some point. The weird thing about it, though, is that it's one of the most under-investigated areas, I think it's fair to say. diagnosis of it is often a diagnosis by exclusion, that they will first of all decide that it's not something else. They will do blood tests and various tests to see what it could possibly be. And eventually, when there's no other decision made, they make this decision to say that, this is vulvodynia. The problem is that it's a very long process. It takes sometimes 3 to 4 years. And there's data to show that, for example, in the US, 40% of patients actually don't bother going through for treatment because it's such a hassle to go through this process of being diagnosed. Why it's so difficult to diagnose, I think, for clinicians is that there is really no available treatment out there at the moment which can be used. Things are being used off-label. The pain drugs being used, which have got wider effects, sometimes side effects that are unwanted. What we have here, though, is a game changer potentially because we have a drug which is being specifically developed and targeting female sexual pain and also female sexual function. I think this will, if it works, and I hope it really does, I think it will really open up the research in this area more than it has been at the moment. In terms of why this is only happening now. It's a mystery to me because it's a massive problem. It's a clear unmet need. And I think the industry perhaps hasn't taken it as serious as it should up to this point.
Yeah, you mentioned a very, very important point there. And I was going to cover this afterwards, actually, because I think like the bigger picture of this is, as you say, really significant. Because what is the reality for most women, as you also mentioned, is it takes a long time to get a diagnosis in the first place. And even getting the vulvodynia diagnosis is often a bit of it's not really that satisfactory because often you're also being subject to this very trial and error approach of trying different medications without really understanding what the underlying driver is of the pain. So I think this type of research is really seminal in that sense. And we'll go into it a bit later into exactly what presentation of vulvodynia you will be testing on in the first instance.
Yeah, we didn't actually expect this ourselves to be such an issue because one of the criteria when we were first looking at the project was to go through patient notes of people that we have on our databases and see how many people actually have a diagnosis of vulvodynia. And it's very, very few. It's nothing like the actual incidence of the condition. And that makes it very difficult, I think, for people. I can well understand why there is a certain reluctance perhaps to try to go through the process of diagnosis.
Exactly. And so I want to then tie it back again to this question of, because the reality is that a lot of women, like myself, when I first got the vulvodynia diagnosis, I was put on amitriptyline. That is also, to my knowledge, trying to target the production of serotonin, right? If I'm not mistaken. And you mentioned that that is also one of the neurotransmitters that may be influenced by this medicine, Pudafensine, while the main one that you're targeting is dopamine. So can we talk a little bit about how it differs? I think that would be helpful for listeners to understand.
I think the important thing to bear in mind, I think, with people who are taking amitriptyline for this condition is, compared to some other CNS conditions, the dose is relatively low. And also the Pudafensine we're taking in this study, although it may well have some affinity for other monoamines, really it's dopamine where we're interested because that's where it's going to have the largest effects. And that's where the studies so far show that we are seeing it appears to be acting. But I think that this specificity is something which is what will help this drug to be more useful in this condition.
Yeah. Okay. And then you've alluded to this a bit previously, but prior to this trial on this drug for vulvodynia, you've also been assessing the effect of Pudafensine in other conditions. So can you tell us a bit about those studies and what the data has shown so far?
Absolutely. I'll take you through the whole process because we've actually been working very closely with the company, Initiator Pharma, who are developing this drug, really from the outset. Bear in mind that before they came to us, they have some preclinical data, and that preclinical data indicated that Pudafensine potentially has an effect in reducing pain and also has an effect on sexual function. So that was starting point. When you then go to say, well, we're going to give this compound, which has never been given to anybody before, to people with pain, you can't just go straight rushing in. You have to go a very step-by-step approach. So the first thing we did, as I mentioned, is a safety study where we give a single dose of it, a very, very low dose, which we know should not produce any effects, to a very small number of healthy volunteers. They are fully monitored in a very safe environment, and we look how the drug is absorbed. We look for things like the PK, safety, tolerability, etc. We then increase the dose gradually until we get to a dose where we perhaps start to see some mild effects coming in. And the reason we're doing that is there's no point in developing a drug if we find that it is got the side effects, like it could be like an opiate, which is probably very addictive, or it's making people so nauseated they can't actually take it. What we want is a drug which is both safe and well tolerated. So the first thing to do is establish, can people take it, which we did. The next question is, okay, so people are taking it, they're not getting side effects, but is this drug actually doing anything? And so there's two ways we can test that. One is by giving it to pain patients and seeing, does it work? The difficulty with that is, I think you're giving unnecessary exposures to people who have got conditions, and you're raising hope without a true signal in humans. So the step that Initiator and ourselves took instead was to do a model of pain. And that is a very simple technique where people who are, again, healthy volunteers, this was in, are injected with a very low dose of capsaicin, which is something which is very hot and very, very powerful. It's an intradermal injection on the forearm, and it is incredibly painful for a very short period of time. What is interesting, though, is in addition to being painful, it also causes a very clear area, what we call allodynia and hyperalgesia. Allodynia is where people often experience this with things like a postherpetic neuralgia after shingles or something, where they're feeling something like a shirt, which was normally very innocuous stimulus, rubs on your skin and it really hurts. So something becomes painful. And also hyperalgesia is something which actually is painful, like a needle prick, becomes more painful. And so what you're effectively doing in our study with capsaicin was taking a healthy person and sending them into a patient for a very short period of time, because certainly 5-6 hours after the injection of capsaicin, there is no pain, there is no hyperalgesia, people go back to their normal state. But what that allows you to do is to test, is the drug actually blocking any mechanisms of pain? And what we were able to show in this, we did in about 24 healthy volunteers, that indeed with Pudafensine, there was a reduction in pain. There was a reduction, a very marked reduction actually in allodynia. And that reduction in allodynia was superior to other pain treatments that are available out there, like pregabalin. So what we've now done was shown it's safe and it actually hits the correct target. And that allows you then to think about the dose to take into the patient studies.
So I just want to stay at that point for a moment, John, because I think that's really significant. So what you're saying is that in a controlled study on healthy volunteers, a single dose of Pudafensine reduced allodynia, which is, as you say, the pain from a stimulus that shouldn't normally be painful. And it did so more effectively than pregabalin, which is one of the drugs that is actually being prescribed to patients with vulvodynia today. And I think for anyone with provoked vestibulodynia, there's, where a light touch to the vestibule causes significant pain. That finding feels very relevant because that is essentially the whole mechanism that defines the condition. So I think that's a really important data point that I wanted to just pause on before we move on to the other studies you've done with this drug.
Yes. Yeah. What we're talking about is the effect on a single dose. Now, I've done probably 20, 25 studies with capsaicin and various drugs. The effect was really very clean. The other thing to mention, of course, in those same people is when they were on their pregabalin, which is often offered as a treatment, they had much worse side effects. So we were getting the reduction without the big side effects, which I think is important.
Yeah, that's great. And just out of curiosity, when you do that study and you inject the capsaicin, how do you also inject the Pudafensine then, or do you take it orally? And how long until the pain is reduced?
What we know from our initial safety study is that the effect of Pudafensine reaches its peak at about 2 hours after dosing. And so what we did was time the capsaicin injection to happen at that point. So when people, it was a placebo-controlled study, so they'd come back on one occasion, they would have no drug, they'd have a placebo drug. On another occasion, they'd have the pregabalin. On other two occasions, they were given the Pudafensine. So what you're trying to do is to challenge them when they're, if you like, at the most vulnerable, and that gives you the biggest pharmacodynamic range to work with.
Yeah, it must be interesting to work with these type of medications, trialing them when there is pain involved.
It's difficult because if you're developing a pain drug, you can't tell whether it's working unless there is pain.
Yes.
And unless you're going to go straight into patients, which, as I said, could involve unnecessary exposure to a drug, this is a great way of surrogate marker to actually show pain.
I'm curious, it's a bit outside of the scope of this conversation, but whether there is innovation happening with, for instance, availability of AI models that can in some way simulate pain? Like, is there innovation there to test some of these drugs?
I think ultimately there will be, but at this stage, I don't think there is anything which is credible or available, unfortunately. I think we still need to go for the out factor of actually giving this to a human being and seeing, can it make a difference to what they're experiencing?
Yeah. Got it. Okay, so that's the pain side of things, but there's another piece of the Pudafensine story that I think is really fascinating. Can you tell us a bit about the study on erectile dysfunction?
We mentioned that it gets into the brain and affects sexual function. In males, the part of the brain being affected, the belief was based again on preclinical animal data that it would allow people who had erectile dysfunction to initiate an erection, but more than that, also maintain it. And that would make it potentially superior for people who have got erectile dysfunction caused by things like diabetes or overweight or alcoholism, that sort of thing. Very exciting. And we took that into a group of, I think we've dosed somewhere over about 130, 140 men with this study, with this drug now. And we have seen that it does have very marked and very clear effects. So that's quite exciting. This is something which we'll be looking at further in further studies. Now we're looking to do in parallel, if you like, is to take this into female population. We know the drug has a very marked effect on blocking things like hyperalgesia and specific pain. So will it have an effect in blocking the pain that people experience when they're touched in these areas, when they have to insert a tampon, when they're trying to have penetrative sex? That is something which we can only test in a proper study, and that's what we're starting to do now. So the first step of that is a study where we're looking at a very small group of people in a very, very controlled environment and seeing, can we detect if there is any reduction from a single dose of Pudafensine in their pain response in that area.
I read that research that came out of the trial that was done on erectile dysfunction with this drug. And what I thought was really interesting was there was this dual action. So there was both a central effect initiating the response and then also a peripheral effect through smooth muscle relaxation. So it's working, as I understand it, both in the brain and then locally at the tissue level as well. So would it be fair to assume that the same thing could happen for patients with vulvodynia, that the Pudafensine might have both a central pain modulating effect and also a local effect on the tissue itself?
There may be limited effects in the tissue itself as well. The effect that will have, we're not sure about yet. I think that the dual effect, if you like, in this situation for the females taking the drug will be the reduction in pain and sensitivity in that area, which will allow them to resume normal activities and will certainly cause an improvement in their overall life and their quality of life, if you like. I mean, it's also worth bearing in mind that the condition itself causes tremendous strain on relationships and people in relationships. It's been shown that partners of people with vulvodynia are much more prone to depression and erectile dysfunction because of the stress and strain of the partner's pain, if you like. And so I think that there is a direct effect that the drug will have in reducing the pain. But what is most important to myself is that we see an improvement in people's quality of lives and that they can really move forward in a way that they want to do and not be held back by this condition.
Okay, so let's go back to the study in question. Can you walk us through exactly what you're testing and also perhaps what a participant's journey looks like from the first contact to the end?
Yeah, I can sort of take you through the patient journey. We have a very big outreach to by various things like social media, via Vulval Pain Society, to people we're trying to targeting people who may suffer from this condition, ask them are they interested in taking part. And the first thing we do then is to give them a really good phone conversation with a trained professional who will talk them through the study, take some of the details of their condition, really make sure that it's a good match, that they do have the correct condition, and also give them the opportunity to ask some questions about it, because many people have never taken part in a clinical trial. And so it's quite important to be able to really explain to people what is involved and sort of demystify it, if you like, because it is a very straightforward process normally. After that initial contact, people, if they are interested and want to take part, will come into one of our units. We're running this study in 2 centres actually at the moment in the UK, in Manchester and in Blackpool, and they'll have a medical. So this is actually, a lot of people do this anyway because it's quite a good way to get a quick MOT, because we'll check everything, make sure people's bloods are normal, that they're healthy apart from the condition. We'll look through their other medications they may be taking in case there's any potential for an interaction, although with Pudafensine it's actually quite a low danger of interaction, so that's good. What we'll also do is make some very rough assessments at that stage of whether the level of pain that they're actually experiencing. And we're doing that in two different ways using very simple techniques, which are very easy to apply and are very well validated. They will involve things such as, well, one is that we ask patients in private, not in the ward environment, to just insert a tampon and to remove it and to rate how painful it is. Because what we want to try to understand in a real life situation, how painful is that experience? The other thing we do is take a standard medical probe, which is called a Wagner probe, and apply that to a couple of points around the vagina to just look how painful it is when that area is touched by one of these medical instruments. It's very quick and very normal part of an examination, that sort of a test. But that gives you a good baseline, a good assessment to make sure that people truly have the condition, both by the medical and by the examination that we do. People who come through that and we decide that you do have the condition, because as I mentioned, it's very hard to actually sometimes diagnose it from the notes. So we're looking at recruiting women aged 18 to 65 who have experienced vulval pain for over a year as a rough entry criteria. They then will be enrolled into the study. Again, every stage we explain what's going to be done. We have medical staff, clinicians taking people through it. We try to keep them the same for every visit so that you can build up a rapport and get used to working with the same people. And they come back 4 times in the study. On each occasion, they take one of 4 treatments. This could be placebo, or it could be one of 3 different doses of Pudafensine.
Okay.
And this allows us to compare what people are like in those exact situations with the drug, with these measures, and we can then see whether on placebo or an active treatment, there is a difference between how people respond in terms of their pain response and the perceived pain response, at least. So for this particular study, it's very much a pilot, if you like. It's what we call a phase 1B study, where it's looking at only a small group of people, 24 people, in fact, will be enrolled. Well, probably 34 will be enrolled, but we expect to get 24 people completing all sessions. Of those 24, we can then compare how people performed on the different doses of Pudafensine against placebo and find out, was the drug actually having an effect?
So just to be clear then, for every participant, you have 4 dosing sessions, 1 which is going to be placebo, and then 3 which are going to be using Pudafensine, but with different doses.
And we change the order. So neither the people doing the measurements nor the patients are told whether they're on placebo or active treatment, so we can't be biased. And we also have 1 week, between 1 to 2 weeks between each of those treatment sessions, to allow the body to really excrete the drug that's potentially been taken the previous week.
Yeah. Okay, understood. And then you were telling us about how you measure pain using these 2 different tests, essentially. The first one, I can't remember the exact name of it. Was it Wagner? Something like that? Wagner, yeah. That's essentially just a version of the Q-tip test then, which many of our listeners would be
very
familiar with. Yeah.
It's a very small Q-tip strain gauge, which is applied to the area, and you just rate how painful it is when it becomes painful. It's very, very straightforward and very routine.
Yeah. And then can you tell me a bit more about the decision to have this additional measurement of pain by using a tampon? Can you explain why it was also chosen as one of the ways to assess whether the drug is helping?
The Wagner Q-tip assessment is the primary endpoint in the study, but we also wanted to put something into it. We were aware from our outreach to various societies and people with the condition that one of the things that people really experience is pain on applying a tampon. It can be so painful, people sometimes will not wish to do it. This obviously is an abnormal response, so it's something which happens in the real world. And so as a secondary endpoint, we ask people to basically apply a tampon and remove it and rate the pain from it. This is done both around the time of the visit, but also between visits as well, to show if there's any ongoing issues. So it's really just an attempt to find a less clinical, a more natural way, if you like, of measuring pain and the quality that this drug may have in modifying vulvodynia.
Okay, understood. And then this trial is looking at single dose administration, if you will, at different points, right? what is the reason behind that? Like, did you consider testing repeated use over weeks or months, or is that out of scope based on where you are currently in the study?
The basic problem, well, it has to be done as baby steps because we've got to make sure it's safe. We've got to make sure it's having an effect. Each of these experiments in their own sense are expensive. To go into a full trial where people will be taking this drug repeatedly is where we want to get to. But that will take much more funding. And to get that funding, we need to demonstrate that we're not only safe and well tolerated, but there is some signal of efficacy. So this current study is actually quite pivotal for this drug. We know we've got strong animal data, but until you go into humans, you don't know whether it's actually going to have the same effect. And so what we're looking for is a signal from this study in these very small group of people on a single dose that will then enable us to get the funding to do a much wider study in a general population. Because what we really want to do is to develop a drug which is not going to work in a clinic and you've got to come into the unit and you've got to go through all this. We want to be able to develop a drug which can be taken at home in the same way that you take an aspirin or a paracetamol and will work for this condition. And that's a much bigger trial over a longer period of time. And to get the funding for that, we need to make sure in these various steps that we have a strong signal that will allow us to take this drug forward.
Okay, so let's go a bit more into eligibility. You mentioned it a bit earlier, but who are you looking for and what does the candidate need to have in terms of diagnosis and history, and also what would exclude someone?
I think easiest thing really is to say that, as I've already mentioned, we're looking for women aged 18 to 65 who either have a diagnosis of vulvodynia, which is not quite as common as you would think, or have suffered pain in this area for over a year. And we say that because we want people who are not necessarily new in their pain career, where it could be a transient thing that they're feeling. We want people who are well-established patients. And that's because we need to be able to try to change those people first. They're the ones where we've got the best chance, I think, of showing the drug effect. So things that would exclude people, I think, would be if they had any other serious conditions. Obviously, if they were trying to get pregnant, because this study itself is still very early, so you won't want to put any risk to any developing child. Any other conditions or abnormalities that were detected in blood results, which could indicate some of the problems. But generally, it's actually one of the easiest to recruit too, because the drug itself, as I've mentioned, appears to have very little interaction with other drugs. The number of drugs which are excluded, often you can't take co-medications. I think with this one, it's much more generous in that. And, my advice to anybody who is interested is to actually get in contact and try and just talk to our telesales, talk to our telephone people and really find out more about the study.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also quite telling the fact that you are including women with both a confirmed diagnosis, but also women who've had symptoms for at least 12 months without a formal diagnosis. That feels quite significant and alluding to the problem that we discussed earlier of just the diagnosis delay for so many women. So yeah, I think that's quite telling. One of the things that I wanted to touch on is other conditions that can exclude certain participants. And again, I think the recommendation would be to get in contact with your company if there is an interest there. But there are some exclusions that are listed in terms of women who have endometriosis or interstitial cystitis or pelvic inflammatory disease. Can you just tell us a bit about the need to exclude those and the rationale behind, because they often overlap with vulvodynia, right? So what is the reasoning there?
Yeah, they definitely do. And I would actually encourage people with these conditions to still reach out, because what we want to be able to do is to go through this study quickly, safely. And if it works, we're going to go into a bigger population. So then it will have to be taken by a wider population. So it'd be good to register, to be aware of people anyway. The main reason is that what we're looking for in this study is a signal. And the best way we can find that signal is by having a very pure sample, where if people have other pain conditions, particularly in that region, or even, to be honest, if you were suffering from daily chronic migraine attacks, it would confuse and confound a number of the variables. And I think it would make it more problematic to show an effect in a very, very small sample. Those people will be included at the next stage when we need to do a bigger, wider community study where really all comers are being taken onto that who's from this condition. And that's where it will really demonstrate, I hope, whether this drug has got the legs to be fully developed.
And in terms of the practicalities of this, and I just want to say, I've also I have personally previously participated in a clinical trial, not for any medication for vulvodynia, but something else. And I will say that the whole process, you feel really taken care of it, through it all. So I would just commend anyone who's listening who might be eligible for it to consider it, because it does make a real difference in terms of pushing the field forwards. But I also wanted to clarify, how long does the study run for, say from eligibility assessment to the end of the trial for an individual person?
It's actually quite a load, unfortunately, and that's the reason why there is actually a stipend involved in this study as well. We do recompense people for the amount of time that they're giving up. It's not being paid for risk; it's being paid for the time that people are giving up to make these essentially 5 trips to our centres. Approximately 14 weeks, I would say, because you have the screening period, and then you have these visits which are roughly 1 week apart, and then there's a final assessment a week later, just to make sure that everything is really safe and that people feel fine. Because that's the important thing. I think you hit a very good point there. When you do a clinical trial, it's like going to quite a nice private hospital, if you like, where there are doctors. We don't want people to feel, I suppose I want to come back to the placebo problem. So sometimes people think that this attention that you're getting from a beautiful unit, from these staff who are really focused on yourself, can make people feel better anyway. We'd really encourage people to really dispassionately think about what they're experiencing when they take part in these studies. It's really important that people truly rate the pain that they're feeling and say anything about the side effects that they're feeling as well, so we can get the best possible and the cleanest data.
Okay, so I wanted to circle back as we approach the end of this episode to the point that we were talking about earlier regarding, if we zoom out a bit and see just how prevalent vulvodynia is. And you mentioned in your communications around the study that there's an estimated 5 million women in the UK could be living with vulvodynia. Yet, as we were speaking about, drug development has been almost non-existent for this type of condition. So I would just love your views as someone in the industry on why this area has been so chronically under-researched, and also perhaps what's changed that in terms of making trials like this possible now?
I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think it's very difficult sometimes for not just this sort of a condition, but for most pain conditions, to find a treatment which is tailored to your specific needs. There is still an over-reliance on a certain number of compounds. We've moved away at least from opiates and the problems that they cause. But there is a certain amount of, perhaps the medical profession have sometimes underestimated the impact of pain conditions. And it's terrible, because the debilitating effect that vulvodynia can actually have on a person and on relationships and families is something which should never be ignored. Now, it could also be that part of the other problem is, until now, there's been nothing as specific as Pudafensine, which shows this very much targeted engagement with the correct parts of the brain, and has also showed us some promising data preclinically. It could just be that it's the right time for it. The next stage for me is to find another, I think it's 20 odd people to actually take part in this study and get this finished as quickly as we can. Because what we want now is to get, we've got the theory, but until we get the data, we do not know that this is working. If that works, I think it'll be full steam ahead. If you look at how other drugs have been developed, if you think about male erectile dysfunction and the discovery of Viagra, which is purely by chance from people developing a drug for a heart condition, all of a sudden Pfizer had this drug, which was a potential game changer in that area. And that focused research into that area, more and more research, more and more funding was put into it. And I think similarly, that I'm hoping this could also kickstart not just this compound, but other compounds in this area as well. Now, the problem is that these trials do take time. Current study we started, I think the first patient was dosed in early February, and we expect to complete dosing probably 3 months' time. So it's even for 24 people, it's a long time investment. But for the next studies, I think we're talking 2 or 3 year durations. And each time we complete a study, we then have to reflect on the data and decide which way to go forward next. I think, unfortunately, we're a good 6 or 7 years away from actually being in the clinic if everything sails perfectly. And, until we do this is we won't know that they're going to do that.
Yeah, I appreciate you being straightforward about that timeline, John, because 6 to 7 years is a long time. And I think for a lot of people living with this condition, hearing that maybe can feel discouraging. But I think what strikes me about what you're describing is that for the first time, there is a drug being developed and tested specifically for vulvodynia. It's not something that's repurposed. It's not something that's off-label, borrowed from another condition, but it's actually designed with this type of pain in mind. And I think that in itself is a shift, regardless of how long the road is. And so what do you want listeners to understand about why their participation or even just raising awareness of this generally moves this forward?
I think there's two parts to that. I think firstly, you're correct. I think just generally talking about it and raising a debate. Before I had the discussions with Initiator, I was completely unaware of how there was this huge unmet need for a huge portion of the population. 5 million people is a huge number, and there is nothing that is currently available for that. And so it's right that we're doing something about it, although perhaps a little late. The second part is personal involvement. I think it's something anybody taking part in this trial is going to find no benefit immediately from it. It's a single dose. It may change things. It may not, but it's not going to change anybody's life taking part in this study. But what I think people will be doing is really contributing to the development of what could potentially be a powerful compound, what may actually go on to be used to treat patients with this condition. And so down the line, something which you may benefit from, but not immediately, unfortunately. We recognize there's a huge commitment of time, and that's very hard when people have got their lives need to go on. And all we can do is we try to make it as easy as possible by helping with transportational costs. I think speak to people. It's very difficult to take part in clinical studies sometimes, but we try to do that. And that's why people get recompense for taking part, because we recognize that they're not going to get benefit. What's going to benefit is the whole area, though. And I think that fueling the debate on it, if we get positive results on this, which I hope I can come back and present to you in about 6 months' time, then I think it will debate in the industry will increase, and I think it will cause other companies also to look at their portfolios and perhaps focus on this very important area.
And I would imagine that even a lot of interest from potential participants in this study would be a positive signal for going the next step in terms of securing the necessary investment for the next step if this is a successful first phase, right? So all those little signals that help that point to this is really needed, I'm sure is helpful in the broader scheme of things, both for you and for the general development of new drugs for vulvodynia.
What shocked me about this is the interest that we've generated by this study. We've had people as far away as Kent inquiring about coming up to Manchester or to Blackpool at their own expense to take part. That's not necessarily what actually would cover their expenses, but the time involved, that people are willing to give up that amount of time and effort to help this study just shows how this condition is affecting people so badly that they're willing to do that. And it's been quite humbling with the interest that we've had.
Thank you so much for your time, John. It's been such a pleasure talking to you and just understanding more about this trial in particular, but also the wider context. So I think this is incredibly interesting, and it gives me a lot of hope and encouragement that this is happening. So thank you. And to anyone listening, if you're in the UK and if this is something that might be relevant for you, I'll put all the links to the study sign up page in the show notes and in my bio. And you can read more about the trial and check the eligibility criteria there. And just would like to reiterate that participants can receive some compensation for their time and also travel expenses. And the clinics are in Blackpool and Manchester. So we'll link all of that to ensure that you have all the signups that you need, John, to take this to the next step. So thank you so much for coming on.
And thank you, Matilda. It's been a really pleasure to talk about it. It's something we care a lot about. And let's hope we get this finished and I can report some good data soon to you.
Yes, looking forward to it. I hope that conversation gave you a lot of hope, as it did for me. If you may be eligible for this type of research, please consider reaching out to Mac Clinical Research to see whether you can participate. Truly, this type of research will not happen unless we have volunteers coming forward for it. And we all know that the research gap for vulvovaginal pain conditions is really large, and studies like this are seminal in trying to address that. So if there's someone you think may be eligible for this or who can help spread the word about this study, please also consider sharing it. It truly makes a big difference. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week.